Without more ado, let me go on to the next part of our webinar. We shall welcome two responders, and each one will have 15 minutes maximum. I am very happy to introduce our first responder, Dr. Roderick Hewitt. Many of you might have heard him or have heard about him because he is a very well-known theologian in the mission field, but he is very unique in the sense that he calls himself a professor in systematic theology and lectures in African theologies in the diaspora, ecumenical theology and missiology. There are not many professors about African theology in the diaspora, so you can imagine how he stimulated tremendous scholarship in this field. Dr. Hewitt actually served in the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa before becoming a visiting professor or fellow at New College at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Hewitt currently serves as president of the International University of the Caribbean in Kingston, Jamaica. He returned to that part of the world to take on this new responsibility 2 years ago. Dr. Hewitt is a graduate of the United Theological College and University in the West Indies. And he graduated with honors and holds a PhD from the University of London. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me now welcome Dr. Hewitt to respond to the keynote address by Dr. Lai. Thank you, Dr. Hewitt. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin by expressing my thanks to the last speaker. I indeed read his notes before and must add that his presentation, the passion in which he presented his perspectives have indeed made a lasting impression. I want to use this opportunity to offer some, they could be classified as random thoughts, some perspectives on the subject, because the Northeast Asian Neo-Cold War, to a great extent, is an ongoing legacy of the USA and the USSR Cold War, which, as we know, was rooted in the USA religio-political phobia with communism, which it was deemed to be a hostile threat to democracy, the American way of life, and even more than that, to capitalism. The ideology that it thought was supposed to be the economic instrument for the global agenda. And although the economic ideology of capitalism eventually has conquered the world with the fall of the Soviet Union, and we have seen its mutation, even with China Communist Party embraced to the extent they have found a way of transforming it, controlled, sponsored system, the second most powerful economy in the world. In other nations, in other countries, autocratic governments have also employed this economic model as an instrument to maintaining corrupt political systems that deny people genuine freedom, as we have heard that in the Soviet Union, with the transfer to the Russian Federation, it moved almost from communism into a model of some classify it as gangsterism, into a new model of controlling capitalism. The close alliance of the United States with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan was rooted in this broader global strategic interest of countering the influences of the triune autocratic states of Russia, China, and North Korea, what was deemed to be their alternative model of living. The selective policy of the United States to support some peoples and nations in their struggles for freedom and democracy against tyrannical autocratic governments must also be factored into the contemporary tensions within Northeast Asia. It is interesting that the USA, being an imperial superpower nation with unparalleled military and economic might, did not view its support for countries struggling for democracy and freedom as what one would have thought anti-colonial solidarity. Rather, the rationale for its support was its fixation on defeating communism. The current neo-Cold War in Northeast Asia, as viewed from the global South, which is the context from which I speak, and especially from the context of the Caribbean region, represents a different perspective on the USA-China new Cold War. Our experience of colonialism, slavery, and European competition within the region, and even now the contemporary global tensions that are resulting from the rivalry between the USA, China, and Russia, have led us to view the participants in Cold War politics not as struggle, not as a struggle between good and evil or between right and wrong. Rather, their involvement in the affairs and for those who are in Latin America and the Caribbean, the other side of the world, it was never done out of altruistic motivation. Rather, it was pure and unadulterated self-interest. And if one were to needle it to the point, it was to prevent what they saw as Cuban-style socialism or communism from spreading throughout the region, and to ensure that the region remained under the sphere of its influence. So I want to speak to some of the issues raised by the previous speaker from that perspective, that our experiences of Cold War in the Caribbean, especially between the USSR then and the USA, was acted out in a focused way over Cuba that almost resulted, let's not forget, 1961 almost produced a new nuclear war. It almost went to a minute to midnight before President Kennedy and the Soviet Union president, they were ready to press the button. The Cuban struggle for sovereignty and independence offers some pertinent insight that may serve as a signpost for the current grave situation within the northeastern region. We in the Caribbean are small island states that are vulnerable to external political and economic shocks. Our service-driven economies that depend on tourism, especially from the USA and the Western world, which can only be exercised allow us to exercise sovereignty in a limited way, because external forces always control our economy. We are always caught between bad choices and not too bad choices. To act in our own interest is deemed to be a luxury that we can't afford. For the commanding heights of our political and economic well-being, we always must seek external permission from the powers, whether they be east or west. Islanders live with vulnerabilities. We know about every year we come in hurricane. We seems like vulnerabilities we face in the region. Life is lived with perennial threats, caught between a rock and a hard place. We are always being asked, which side are you on? That's the question mark. I think it offers some global resonance here. Which side are you on? We are always being forced to take sides, like the Northeastern Asian region, but to a far lesser extent, the competing interest of the USA and China within the Caribbean region also results in political instability of small nations who are caught between their competing economic and political interests. They both exert intense economic and political pressure for islands to take sides and to pledge loyalty to them. Little room is left for neutrality. Anyway the islands turn, they lose. The nations that try to maintain diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, for example, are locked out from many of the economic investments from China. This comes at a time when the USA and the European, the wider Western world are not willing to compete economically with China in investing in the infrastructural needs of such states. It could be argued that the China model of economic investment is producing a new form of economic colonialism. It's another way of controlling the world, because we are entering, or nations are entering, unsustainable contracts and pledging prime assets of their nation, such as ports, prime lands, major infrastructure as collaterals for the investment from China. Therefore, China is owning a lot of different countries by it could be have jumped out of the national crisis, the contemporary scene, for example, mentioned by Dr. Lin, the national crisis within the Pacific Islands of the Pacific, the Solomon Islands, demonstrate the dilemma facing vulnerable island states. The government there decided recently to switch its political allegiance from Taiwan to China. And that has resulted in major uprising, civil unrest that necessitated the intervention of Australia, sending troops to maintaining peace or restoring peace. So any which way one turns within the context of rivalry with the powers, the small nation states lose. Within the Caribbean region, as I pointed out, Cuba exemplified this Cold War dilemma and is paying a high price for its claim to Cuba under caste entity as a sovereign state in 1959. It was invaded. And when the Soviet Union tried to protect, as I pointed out, it almost resulted in a nuclear war. So the price for independence is always costly. during the Cold War between the USA and the USSR of the Global South referred, and if you remember, they formed what was called non-aligned movement. The former Yugoslavia President Tito, and the official forming of that movement in 1961. It functioned as an independent path in the world politics that would in the strategic powers of the USA and the USSR. The grouping of nations was able to walk carefully between the competing interests of superpowers. It's very interesting that China was then an observer member of that movement. As I reflected on it, I said, wow, times have really changed. China has evolved from that status to now being what one could call a superpower, the second most powerful world economy with growing global military might.
Excuse me for interrupting, Dr. Hewitt. You have 5 minutes remaining.
Yes, I will finish in that 5. There is one of our singers that we have shared with the world, Bob Marley. He says, we refuse to be what you want us to be. We are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be. I think that's part of the new rallying cry that small states caught between the powers need to assert. I would argue that a new alignment movement, non-alignment movement is needed in the contemporary era to navigate the evolving new Cold War politics. In this era of growing right-wing autocratic governments, the world is being divided up into different spheres of influence. The threat posed to Taiwan, real and present danger, is consistent even with the current threat being faced by Ukraine against the Russian aggression. Unfortunately, I don't buy into the assessment that the current new Cold War is one in which one side can be deemed to be a major wrong and the other by default becomes major right. What history teaches is that powerful nations always act to support their national self-interest. To counter such powerful global forces, nation states that are not so powerful, we need solidarity, especially among these nations. I think Taiwan needs to invest heavily in its solidarity with the South. It is when nations come together with what is deemed to be their powerlessness, their independence, their sovereignty, their freedom cannot be secured through alliance to any empire on the left or the right. Theologically, I would say, when you're caught between Egypt and Assyria, we need to find strength in a stronger power and not between these competing empires. And so my prayer, my hope, my focus is that Taiwan and its hold on its sovereignty, its democracy, will indeed be the David that wins out against the Goliath. But it needs others to be in total solidarity. And such strength can only be found from the South, engaging in its solidarity with nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewitt.